Okay, so we always hear that Jesus is God and Jesus is co-equal with God, and Jesus is second part of the Trinity. The Trinity is Son is equal to the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit is equal to God the Father. So these three are co-equal in essence. So that's the Trinity, right? So where do Christians get the Trinity from? They're not getting it from the New Testament. They're getting it from tradition after the New Testament. So let's go to the Gospels. What do the Gospels say? The earliest record, as Christian apologists would say, what does the earliest record of Jesus say? Well, I want to draw attention to, or I want to draw emphasis to one verse in the New Testament, John chapter 20, verse 17. It says, Jesus said unto her, Mary Magdalene, touch me not, I am not yet ascended to my Father, but go to my brethren and say to them, I ascend to my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God. This is the King James version of the Bible. So the problem here is, now I want to draw attention to what Jesus says here. He says, I ascend unto my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God. So pay attention to those last part of this verse. He says, I ascend unto my God and your God. So that means what we can see from this verse is that Jesus has a God, and that God is the same God as his God and Mary Magdalene's God. He says, my God and your God. So Jesus is saying that I have the same God as Mary Magdalene. Because Mary Magdalene was touching him, and he is saying, touch me not, for I'm not ascended to my Father. So I'm ascending to my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God. Now, this verse is one of the strongest proofs that there is no Trinity. So notice what Jesus told Mary Magdalene, that he's ascending to my God and your God. Jesus' statement makes it clear that God is both his God and Mary Magdalene's God. If Jesus is God, he cannot have a God. By definition, if someone has a God, he cannot be God. So notice what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying that he has a God. He says, my God and your God. So Jesus' God is the same as Mary Magdalene's God and the disciples' God. So what this means is that, Jesus has a God. So if Jesus has a God, he cannot be, co-equal to God, and he cannot be God. So if Jesus had a God, as he said, he cannot be part of that God. Jesus cannot be, co-equal to the Father if he has a God. Because if someone has a God, then that God is greater or bigger than that person, right? Like if I say I have a God, that means I'm not equal to that God, because God is greater or bigger or more than in, or is much bigger in quality and essence than somebody who, is not somebody who's, lower than God. So Jesus is saying he's lower than God. He's not co-equal to God. He has a God. That means he's lower than God in essence and in quality. What else I wanted to say? So everybody understands the phrase "my God." Christ used it both before and after his resurrection. He called "my God" when he was on the cross. If you read the Gospel of Mark and Matthew, Jesus says, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" So when Jesus is on the cross, he's crying out to his God. He's not crying out to himself. He's crying out to his God. That means Jesus has a God, and he's not co-equal to that God, or he's not the same essence as that God. When he told Mary Magdalene he was going to ascend to my God, he spoke of my God in the book of Revelation, chapter 3, verse 2, and Revelation, chapter 3, verse 12. So Jesus has a God according to Revelations, chapter 3, verse 12, and John chapter 20, verse 17. It's hard to see how Jesus can be assumed to be co-equal and co-eternal, or the same, the same as God, when, or co-equal and co-eternal with God, when he says that, God is his God, is my God. Notice how Jesus says, my God and your God. So he's telling Mary Magdalene that he has the same God as Mary Magdalene. And we all know Mary Magdalene is not, co-equal with God or the same as God. Of course, God is bigger and, higher than Mary Magdalene ever was. So Jesus and Mary Magdalene have the same God, according to, John chapter 20, verse 17. They have the same God. So if they have the same God, then that God is greater than them in quality and essence. So what John chapter 20 verse 17 is saying is that Jesus has a God, and that God is the same as Mary Magdalene's God. Uh, you know, and this simply means that God is indeed both our God and Jesus' God. So Jesus is saying, so if Jesus were God, he would have been Mary Magdalene's God too. He would not have said that he was going to her God, because her God, i.e., Jesus himself, was standing right there. So this is one of the clearest verses that disproves Jesus as God, as co-equal with God in the Trinity, is John chapter 20, verse 17, because it's Jesus' statement makes it clear that Jesus has a God, and that his God is both, Jesus' God and Mary Magdalene's God. If Jesus is God, he cannot have a God. But for by definition, if someone has a God, he cannot be co-equal with God. Jesus has a God, therefore he cannot be part of that God, or he can't be co-equal with that God. He has to be lesser than that God. So this is clear that he and Mary Magdalene have the same God. So John chapter 20 verse 17 is one of the clearest proofs that there is no Trinity, and that Jesus has a God. Therefore, Jesus is not co-equal with God, and that God of Jesus is the same as the disciples and Mary Magdalene's God. Therefore, Jesus, Mary Magdalene, and the disciples uh, have the same God. And we all know that Mary Magdalene and the disciples are not co-equal with God, or the same essence or quality as God. Therefore, John chapter 20, verse 17 proves that that there's no Trinity and Jesus has a God. Therefore, Jesus cannot be God or co-equal with that God that is the same God as, Mary Magdalene and my brethren. When Jesus says my brethren, he means his disciples, etc. Stay tuned. More videos coming up debunking the Trinity and the so-called Jesus divinity using just New Testament verses.